Ladies and gentlemen, I'm so pleased to have this chance to visit with you. I am Enos Foreman. I am the editor and proprietor of the Wooster Republican newspaper here in Wooster, Ohio. And I have the great privilege of being a friend of Major Thomas Eckert. Major Eckert is the chief telegrapher in the War Department here, just a few steps from the White House, as far as that's concerned. And Major Eckert grew up in Worcester, so we were friends. There's quite a difference in our age as far as that's concerned. Well, as just a young lad, just a little bit about Major Eckert. As a young lad, he became fascinated with the telegraph and soon learned the Morse code. And he became the Worcester postmaster and had the telegraph lines run into the post office. And he was Worcester's first telegrapher. Tom went off to the war after it started, and he was soon assigned to the telegraph office. And it's very obvious I was too old to join the Army, which I have regretted many times, but hopefully I have done a service to our country by reporting and editing for our newspaper. Well, part of my program here, I'll be reading segments of my news reports, and I might mention many times I'll just refer to folks with their last names, and this is not a disrespectful thing by any means. Well, especially with President Lincoln, I could not have more respect for gentlemen than I have for him. So, well, going on, January 1st. Starting out the year was when Mr. Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And his comment, "I never in my life felt more certain that I am doing the right than I do in signing this paper. If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." Well, on July the 22nd, was when Mr. Lincoln revealed to his cabinet his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which was a legal document promising to free some 3.5 million slaves in the states that were in rebellion. This was a surprise, even a shock to his cabinet. Henry Seward advised waiting to issue the proclamation until after a Union victory, so the measure could not be viewed as the last measure of an exhausted government. Well, on September 22nd, after the Battle of Antietam, was when Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which would be signed and made official on January the 1st of 1863, this day that we are talking about today. This proclamation freed the slaves in the states in rebellion. This gave the South 100 days to give up the war and to rejoin the Union and be able to keep their slaves. And Mr. Lincoln took full responsibility for that proclamation. Well, going on, March the 3rd, I'm just hitting on the highlights of during this year, and many of these I could make a whole program regarding. But March the 3rd was when Congress passed the Conscription Act, the first draft law ever enacted by Congress. The law applied to all able-bodied male citizens ages 20 to 45 years of age. Anyone having $300 cash, however, and willing to pay it as a bounty to a substitute was exempt and could stay at home and laugh at the war. And I think that was a very, very unfair thing for the Congress to do. And there'll be more a little later as far as the Conscription Act. Well, March the 3rd was when Congress also gave the power to President Lincoln to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. This was a result of the Copperhead movement, which was led by Congressman Clement Valandigham of Dayton, Ohio. And there will be more later regarding Congressman Valandigham. Well, March the 25th was the very first Medal of Honor issued to Ohioan Jacob Parrott for his actions as part of the Great Locomotive Chase, also known as the Andrews Raid. Parrott and the other raiders captured a train outside of Atlanta, Georgia, and attempted to destroy bridges and railroad tracks between Atlanta and Chattanooga, Tennessee on April the 12th of 1862. And again, I could certainly make a whole program on that. So, well, April 30th to May the 6th, the Battle of Chancellorsville, fought near the village of Chancellorsville, Virginia. The Union Army General Joseph Hooker's Army of the Potomac was twice the size of the Confederate General Robert Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, and yet the Union lost the battle. However, both sides suffered massive casualties, and Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson was mortally wounded by a friendly fire, one of his own men, a loss that Lee said was like losing my right arm. It was one of the Union's most costly defeats in the war. Union losses are 17,000 killed, wounded, and missing out of the 130,000, and the Confederates lose 13,000 out of 60,000. When Lincoln heard the news of the massive defeat, he walked up and down the room saying, my God, what will the country say? What will the country say?" Well, May the 4th, Congressman Valandigham, who was a Peace Democrat at Copperhead, as I mentioned a little bit ago, was arrested today in Dayton when pressing his views for a quick peace with the South to end this useless bloodshedding, and he referred to the president as King Lincoln. Well, on May the 19th, Valandigham was denied a writ of habeas corpus. He was sentenced to imprisonment until the war was over. With a strong protest and disagreement, President Lincoln commuted the sentence and ordered Valandigham to be sent beyond the Union lines down into the hands of the rebels. Well, May 19th, General Grant arrived at Vicksburg after defeating the rebels in 3 separate battles. Efforts to take the city today were frustrated by stiff rebel resistance. There were some 4,000 Union casualties and some 4,500 rebels were captured over the past 4 days. On May the 22nd, General Grant stormed Vicksburg only to suffer heavy losses and repulse. Estimates were of 3,000 Union losses and few rebel losses. Grant was convinced that Vicksburg cannot be taken without a siege to starve out the rebel garrison. After 7 days of siege and daily bombardment, conditions were almost unbelievable. Horse and mule meat was considered a delicacy. Even dogs and rats had become part of a meager diet of the people. Some sections of the front line are active with sniper firing. In other sections, Yanks and Rebs converse and exchange tobacco and newspapers. Twice the Yankees have exploded mines under rebel defenses, but with little tactical advantage gained. And there will be more about Vicksburg, of course. Well, May the 27th, 2 regiments of New Orleans free Negroes and Louisiana ex-slaves participated in an assault on Port Hudson, a Confederate stronghold on the lower Mississippi. The attack failed, but the Negroes fought heroically, advancing over open ground in the face of deadly artillery fire. A white officer of engineers who had witnessed the assault declared that you have no idea how my prejudices with regard to Negro troops have been dispelled by the battle the other day. The brigade of Negroes behaved magnificently and they fought splendidly, could not have done better. They are far superior in discipline to the white troops and just as brave. And the moderate New York Times, commenting on the reports of the battle, said that this official testimony settles the question that the Negro race can fight. It is no longer possible to doubt the bravery and steadiness of the colored race when rightly led. Well, on June the 3rd, General Lee's army on the move to Pennsylvania. Long lines of gray infantry followed by scores of artillery and miles of wagon trains are on the move west of Fredericksburg. No counter movement has been noted in the Union Army. Tight control of the river fords by rebel cavalry kept probing Yankee horsemen from discovering the move. Lee's army totals about 78,000. 10,000 of these are cavalry under General Jeb Stuart. General Lee has not revealed the purpose of the move. June the 9th was a huge cavalry battle of Brandy Station. The day-long series of charges and countercharges at the beginning of the Gettysburg campaign cost the Union more than 900 casualties, the Confederacy more than 500. The brilliant Confederate cavalry general Jeb Stuart was deeply embarrassed that the Union's attack had taken him by surprise. The Union general Alfred Pleasonton surprised the rebels in the early morning fog. They fought all day, and the Yankees withdrew near dusk. The battle, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to change that. The battle served notice on the Union forces that Lee's army was on the move to the north. The rebels learned that the Union cavalry is a hard-hitting and well-led combat force. Now, June the 20th, West Virginia becomes the 35th state of the Union. You are very welcome, West Virginia. June 26, Admiral Andrew Foote died today from a wound that he received some 16 months ago during the attack on Fort Donelson in Tennessee. What a sad thing to lose Admiral Foote. July the 1st, Gettysburg. The Confederate troops under General A.P. Hill were en route to town and ran into the Yankees under General John Reynolds west and north of town. Vicious fighting took place, and General Reynolds was killed. After General Rubel Early's division arrived, the Union Army was outflanked and broke, streaming through the streets of Gettysburg, losing 4,000 men killed and captured. The Federal line crumpled and fell back more than a mile to Cemetery Ridge below town. One of the atrocities here at Gettysburg was the Confederate troops capturing, kidnapping African-American folks that were free folks and sending them south into slavery. July the 2nd, some of the most vicious and bloody fighting of the war occurred in the Peach Orchard and wheat field, which was covered with the dead as the Confederates drove toward a rocky hill called Little Round Top. Union forces just barely beat the Confederate forces to the top of Little Round Top, a hill at the southern extreme end of the Union line. The Union forces took defensive positions, piling up rocks and making breastworks, and under the command of Joshua Chamberlain, held off numerous Confederate attacks. They were virtually out of ammunition, and the Confederates about to attack again. Chamberlain ordered that when the Confederate troops charged up the hill again, the Union soldiers were to get up from their defensive positions at the hilltop and charge downhill in a line toward the Confederate troops, yelling for all they were worth. They did. Their bold actions stopped the Confederate charge and resulted in the capture of Confederate soldiers. Some other things happened on July the 2nd, with the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. While returning the 3 miles or so back to the White House from the Lincoln Cottage at the soldiers' home, that's where the Lincolns stayed during the hot summertime, Mary Lincoln's carriage crashed, probably as a result of sabotage, throwing her from the carriage and causing her to hit her head hard up on a rock and cutting her badly. Well, years later, her son Robert would say that she was never the same after that accident, with terrible migraine headaches. Also on July 2nd, it was a blessing. Only one civilian was killed during the battle, which raged in and around Gettysburg. Miss Virginia Jenny Wade was killed in her home when a sniper's bullet came into her kitchen while she was baking bread for the soldiers. And what a sad thing that was, although it was a blessing that Jenny died instantly, did not have to suffer. Now to July the 3rd, the third day of the battles there at Gettysburg. On this day, following a lull in the battle, at 1 o'clock, the Confederate artillery opened fire in the center of the Union line with 159 guns. More than 170 Union batteries along Cemetery Ridge soon answered for the greatest artillery duel in history. The earth shook. Then 15,000 rebels, including General Pickett's division, stepped out in alignment across a mile of open fields. The Union batteries tore gaping holes in their lines. When 200 yards from the Federal front, the rebels charged at a stone wall near the center of the line. Desperate hand-to-hand fighting occurred. Many of Pickett's troops surged over the wall and came close to succeeding, but were repulsed by the Yankees. Less than 7,000 returned after the charge. Where their attack stalled on that low-angle slope has been called the high water mark of the Confederacy. Well, more than 23,000 Union troops fell, with Confederate losses of 28,000 for the 3 days. More than 4,500 horses were killed during those battles during those 3 days. By the way, there were a total of 329 guns and the artillery firing that afternoon on the third day. Nope. July 3rd, another battle raged 2 miles east of Cemetery Ridge when General Jeb Stuart and his rebel cavalry was stopped on their way to charge the back of the Union line. The Union cavalry under General George Custer led this attack. On July the 4th, then was when General John Pemberton surrendered Vicksburg. 30,000 Confederate troops marched out of the city and stacked their arms inside the Union lines. General Grant had taken 172 cannon and 60,000 muskets. Vicksburg was important because Confederate guns on the bluffs above the river could shell any passing ships, effectively closing the river. On July the 5th, back to Gettysburg, General Lee went back towards Virginia with horrible rains and flooding. General Meade delayed before pursuing Lee, thus the Union missed another chance to destroy Lee's army. And a sad story, many of the buildings there in Gettysburg were used as hospitals, and the cemetery building was used at a hospital, and the basement. There were many soldiers, many wounded soldiers who were lying there on the floor of the basement, and they were not able to get up, able to get around, and the basement flooded, and here they drowned after all the horrible things that they had been through. It just makes me shudder to think many of these things. Well, July the 9th, when Port Hudson, Louisiana surrendered 5 days after Vicksburg, the Union controlled the entire Mississippi River. And moreover, the Confederacy was effectively split in two, east to west. Mr. Lincoln said that now the Father of Waters flows unvexed to the sea. Well, July the 13th was the New York City anti-draft riots. Angry young men, mostly immigrants who were unskilled Irish workers in New York City, violently rebelled against the draft and the unfair rule that wealthy men could buy their way out for $300. The protest quickly turned into an ugly race riot, and rioters attacked blacks all over the city. The 69th New York Regiment, an all-Irish unit, marched from the battlefield at Gettysburg and helped to crush the mobs in New York streets. The riots resulted in 119 dead and millions of dollars in damages. July 13th, the Confederate Brigadier General John Hunt Morgan entered Ohio during his raid, called Morgan's Raid. which began June the 11th in Tennessee and came through Kentucky and Indiana. His cavalry troops destroyed bridges, railroads, and government stores, covering 1,000 miles in 46 days in Ohio. On July the 26th, finally, Morgan was defeated and captured near West Point, below Lisbon, here at Columbiana, Ohio. Morgan was taken to the Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus, from which he and 6 of his officers managed to escape on November the 27th. General Morgan was able to return to the South after his escape. July 13th, the Confederate Congress voted that captured white officers, black Union troops, would not be exchanged for Confederate soldiers captured by the North. They would instead face court-martial on the field and summary execution. Moreover, captured Union soldiers would not be exchanged. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton formally suspended all exchange of prisoners between the North and the South. To continue prisoner exchange in the face of the Confederacy's policy would be a substantial abandonment of the colored troops and their officers, a shameful dishonor to the government bound to protect them. This was the beginning of Civil War prison camps, which were horrendous, to say the very, very least. And it makes me so sad to see pictures of these poor fellows and the circumstances. Well, July the 18th, Union troops led by Colonel Robert Goldshaw and the African-American soldiers in the 54th Regiment of Massachusetts Voluntary Infantry attacked Fort Wagner in South Carolina. Historian James McPherson wrote, as the column approached the fort, the Confederates opened a murderous fire, cutting wide swaths in the ranks of the 54th. Still they came, charging on to the parapet, swarming into the fort itself. Shaw was killed at the head of his regiment. His men fought on desperately until the failure of supporting white regiments, let me repeat that, the failure of supporting white regiments to come up compelled a general retreat. In the face of heavy odds, black troops had proved once again their courage, determination, and willingness to die for the freedom of their race. Well, July 24th, after almost 6 months of waiting at Murfreesboro, General Rosecrans moved his 3 Army Corps against Confederate General Bragg's position at Tullahoma. In a vigorous campaign of 9 days during horrible rainstorms, Bragg was compelled to abandon Middle Tennessee and retreat into Chattanooga. On August the 10th, 25 years after Frederick Douglass fled from Baltimore on the Underground Railroad, the famous abolitionist returned to Baltimore by train and then was on his way to Washington City to meet President Lincoln. Lincoln rose to greet Douglass, and putting out his hand, he said, "Mr. Douglass, I know you. I have read about you. Sit down. I am glad to see you." And as Douglass left their meeting, Lincoln told him, "Mr. Douglass, never come to Washington without calling upon me." August 21st in Lawrence, Kansas, another horrendous happening. A band of 300 led by Colonel William C. Quantrill, and I regret to say that Quantrill was born in Ohio, well, Canal Dover, not too far down from Worcester, committed one of the war's worst atrocities. This was the scene of one of the cruelest and most vicious acts of the war. Quantrill's raiders dashed into the defenseless town, which was the home to Free State abolitionists since the 1850s, and they began to pillage and slaughter the poor folks. They dragged women and children from their beds. They shot unarmed men and boys and looted stores and homes. 150 men and boys were killed, and the town was burned to the ground with charred bodies lying everywhere. Well, September the 5th, General Burnside and army entered Knoxville with no opposition. The city was evacuated last week with Bragg's orders to help fight Rosecrans' orders at Chattanooga. From the beginning of the war, President Lincoln desired to relieve the loyal people of Eastern Tennessee from the hardships and persecutions they were suffering, but had not been able to do so until now. Well, September 9th, after a very successful and brilliant campaign of 3 weeks with General Bragg and retreat, General Rosecrans' army entered Chattanooga without a battle. This may be one of the most important achievements of the war, and it reveals a master strategy on the part of General Rosecrans. Some of Rosecrans' army moved below Chattanooga then, with some 40 miles separating his right from his left, which was a very precarious position. 3 corps are moving along the narrow, muddy mountain roads with 15 miles separating them. Rosecrans' total force numbers 64,000 men, with Bragg's about 65,000. In other words, just about even. And you probably know with this image here that we're actually looking over the Georgia line. We're up on Lookout Mountain, looking over the Georgia line into Chattanooga. September 19th and 20th, the Battle of Chickamauga Creek. Determined to reoccupy Chattanooga, Bragg rushed with Rosecrans' army at Davis Crossroads. While they marched on September the 18th, his cavalry and infantry skirmished with Union mounted infantry, who were armed with state-of-the-art Spencer repeating rifles. Fighting began in earnest on the morning of the 19th near Chickamauga Creek. Bragg's men heavily assaulted Rosecrans' line, but the Union line held. Fighting resumed the following day. That afternoon, 8 fresh brigades from the Army of Northern Virginia under General James Longstreet exploited a gap in the Federal line, driving 1/3 of the Rosecrans army, including Rosecrans himself, from the field. Only a portion of the Federal Army under General George Thomas staved off disaster by holding Horseshoe Ridge against repeated assaults, allowing the Yankees to withdraw after nightfall. The defeated Union troops retreated to Chattanooga, where they remained until late November. The result was the second bloodiest engagement of the war after Gettysburg. There were 35,000 casualties with 4,000 killed. And Lincoln was especially sorrowed by the death of his wife's brother-in-law, who was the Confederate Brigadier General Benjamin Helm during this battle. And by the way, President Lincoln had offered Ben Helm a position with the Union Army, but he felt so strongly that he went with the South. And well, Benjamin Helm was married to Emily, married Todd Lincoln's little sister, I believe some 16 years younger. And she was almost like a daughter to the president and Mrs. Lincoln. Well, October 3rd, more than 17,000 troops under General W.T. Sherman are en route from Vicksburg, Mississippi, to reinforce Rosecrans' army in Chattanooga. They are traveling up the river to Memphis by boat and the remainder of the 675 miles by train. October 3rd, President Lincoln issued a proclamation which set the precedent for America's National Day of Thanksgiving and designates the last Thursday of November next as a day of thanksgiving and praise. On October 8th, the situation of the Union Army under siege in Chattanooga is getting more serious each hour. Heavy rains have made impassable the one mountain road left open to the supply base. The horses and mules are dying from the heavy work and lack of food. The Army is on emergency rations, and the city's food supply is dwindling rapidly. Well, October the 23rd, General Grant, now assigned to the Division of the Mississippi, controlling the armies of the Tennessee, Cumberland, and Ohio, arrived in Chattanooga today and immediately set to work to open the supply line to his new command. Since their defeat at the Battle of Chickamauga, the Union Army was besieged inside of Chattanooga, cold and hungry. Malnutrition and low morale were the first problems to solve. Many were without shoes and sufficient clothing. Some 10,000 mules and horses have died and litter the roadsides. But General Rosecrans was relieved at duty after General Grant got there, and General Rosecrans had to have been horribly devastated at the happenings there. So. Well, October the 27th, troops under General Joe Hooker have opened a 60-mile cracker line during the pitch dark that evening. The brigade of General William Haxon floated silently down the Tennessee River past rebel lines in the pitch black, and the rebel lines were there on Lookout Mountain and surprised the Confederates then at Brown's Ferry. Well, they are now laying a pontoon bridge across the river at that point, immediately inspiring all in the city. Well, about November 1st, Lincoln was invited by David Wills to the dedication ceremony of the National Cemetery in Gettysburg. And I don't think that they expected the president to attend, but the president felt under the circumstances that he should attend. So when they received his acceptance, which was a surprise, why they felt as a courtesy, they should ask him to say a few appropriate remarks with the emphasis on a few, and more a little later regarding that. Well, you might be interested. November the 9th, a fan of the theater, that was one of the places that President Lincoln and his wife could go to get away from the troubles. They enjoyed a play entitled The Marble Heart, which starred John Wilkes Booth. November 18th was when the president traveled by train to Gettysburg with other dignitaries from Washington City for the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery, which was the next day, November the 9th. 3,512 soldiers were buried in the new cemetery. The Honorable Edward Everett delivered a magnificent 2-hour address honoring those who were buried and the thousands that had fought there. While suffering from a fever in the early stages of smallpox, Abraham Lincoln delivers a short speech. Again, just a few appropriate remarks, just 10 sentences to the crowd. They returned to Washington City the evening after the ceremony, and I do regret that I was not there. I'm sure I would have enjoyed that very, very special occasion. And here are the few words that the president did deliver, and I hope that I can do justice to them. I will deliver them the way that I imagine that Mr. Lincoln delivered them anyhow. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. And it is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, no long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and a government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Well, I'll just say very quickly, when Mr. Lincoln finished those few remarks, received very little applause. He thought the speech to be a failure, a flat failure. And I suppose the folks couldn't believe he was finished already, just a little over 2 minutes or so after having listened to a 2-hour address. November 23rd to 25th, the Third Battle of Chattanooga. Major General William Sherman arrived with his 4 divisions in mid-November, and the Federals began offensive operations. On November 23rd, 24th, Union forces struck out and captured Orchard Knob and Lookout Mountain. General Joe Hooker's men stormed Lookout Mountain and planted the stars and stripes on the summit, fighting through such dense fog that it was remembered as a battle above the clouds. On November 25th, Union soldiers assaulted and carried the seemingly impregnable Confederate position on Missionary Ridge. Bragg's army had occupied the 6-mile crest of Missionary Ridge east of the city. One of the Confederacy's 2 major armies was routed. 4,000 Confederates were taken prisoner. The Federals held Chattanooga, the gateway to the lower South, which became the supply and logistics base for Sherman's 1864 Atlanta campaign. Well, November 26th was the first national day of Thanksgiving and praise in America, as declared by Abraham Lincoln. By the way, Mr. Lincoln was suffering from the smallpox, and the White House had been quarantined, with Mr. Lincoln confined to bed much of the time with variola, a small form of smallpox. He, of course, then trying to add some humor to everything, he remarked that he finally has something he can give to everybody. Well, something else quite interesting, December the 17th, was when the Custis-Lee Mansion and the estate, home of General Robert Lee, became the property of the United States government for non-payment of back taxes. Taxes due were $92.07. And I'm sure you're all familiar with that becoming the Arlington Cemetery, such a beautiful place. It was during the summer of 1863, the Buckeye State Governor David Todd visited Washington, D.C. A Democrat who supported the war. He paid his respect to Lincoln. He was shocked at the lack of security provided for the chief executive. Well, it was too easy for, he was concerned about Confederate sympathizers slipping into Washington and terrorizing the president. Well, Governor Todd applied to the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, for permission to raise a cavalry company of 100 troopers to protect the president as a mounted bodyguard. Then on December 23rd was when the 7th Independent Company of the Ohio Volunteer Infantry, also known as the Union Light Guard, began to guard President Lincoln. December the 29th, General Grant arrived in Nashville, where he established his headquarters, and he will remain there until further notice. The general feels that he can better oversee the operations of the Western Military Department from the central point. Well, that wraps up the highlights of the year of 1863, and I do thank you for your kind attention, and I appreciate Mr. Lincoln's statement that he hoped that the end of the war will be the beginning of peace on this earth.